Welcome everyone to this segment of the Master Commercial Poultry Producer Program. My name is Tom Tabler. I'm the new Poultry Extension Specialist at UT, and today we're talking about preventing fires in litter storage buildings. So, dry stack sheds are an important component of every poultry farm's waste management program. Everyone's got to have one of these things today in terms of, keeping litter dry, being able to spread it when you need to spread it, working around weather conditions when you're between flocks. So litter today must be handled in an environmentally sound manner. We've got to keep it in the dry. We can't let it run off. We've got to do what we're supposed to do to protect the environment because everyone's watching us closer today than they ever have in the past. And dry stack sheds do allow producers to store litter until the appropriate application time. If it's raining whenever you're out of chickens and you're trying to decake, or it's the wrong time of the year to spread, everyone's got to have some way to take care of that stuff and store it until we actually need it on our crops. So it helps protect the litter from the elements. It preserves the nutrients that are in that litter. It lessens the leaching and runoff threat because, again, we can keep it in the dry. And it allows for proper timing of land application to best meet the crop and the forage needs. However, despite all the benefits that come with dry stack sheds, storing litter does come with a fire danger. Heat and methane gas are produced from microbial activity that's in stored litter, so spontaneous combustion can occur from buildup of heat and methane. Some folks don't believe spontaneous combustion is actually occurable, but it certainly can. It's similar to what happens with hay bales or silage that catch fire just because of the way the conditions happen to be at that time. And it can occur in litter stacking sheds if litter is stacked too close to the shed walls, it's stacked too high, or it's compacted too tight, where the methane and the heat cannot be released from that litter. It involves both biological and chemical factors that really we do not understand all that well. It happens, but we can't explain to you step by step exactly when, how, where, or why this does occur, but it certainly can occur. So heat is generated when microbial activity occurs in an insulated environment, and that's what you've got when you've got a lot of litter stacked in the shed. It's an insulated environment. Spontaneous combustion is not really all that common in hay barns, coal piles, landfills, and even containers of old oily rags under the right conditions. So for methane to be produced, conditions must be right for the growth of anaerobic bacteria. And for the conditions to be right, in most cases, you've got to have, greater than 40% moisture content, which oftentimes we do have in wet cake litter that we're stored in the shed, or an oxygen-free or a very low oxygen environment. Anaerobic bacteria cannot have very much oxygen. So if you've got an oxygen-free environment or a very low oxygen environment, that encourages the growth of antibiotic or anaerobic bacteria. Methane has a specific gravity that's less than air, so it can escape to the atmosphere given the proper conditions, but we've got to have adequate pore space in that litter. It can't be real wet and heavy and packed down. We don't need to drive back and forth over it in our shed with the tractor to pack it down because, again, if you squeeze all the pore space out, that encourages anaerobic bacteria growth, and then the heat can escape and the methane can escape. So compacted litter may not have adequate pore space, and it may allow the methane and the heat to build up to a point in the pile that it may actually catch the litter on fire. Methane is flammable in the air at a concentration of 5 to 15%, and as such, methane production in stored litter is a potential fire hazard. So, some of the things to avoid. Do not compact stored litter. The picture in the slide here shows a full stacking shed full of litter, and the grower's been running back and forth over that shed to get that litter all the way to the back. But again, that's packing that litter down, and that's squeezing out all the pore space, and that's a perfect environment for methane and heat to build up because it can escape very well. And do not insulate the pile by adding litter on top of previously stored litter. You know, folks do this all the time. Add more material to the shed if the shed's not full. But again, putting litter on top of litter, especially dry litter that's in the shed, when it has wet litter from the next flock or from the next time you add litter to it piled on top of that, that little insulating layer where the wet litter meets the dry litter or the new litter meets the old litter that you've already put in the shed, you know, is a risk factor. So overheating and spontaneous combustion are a lot more likely in those situations. You know, litter temperatures can rise to the point where it's more than 190 degrees in that litter. And microbial activity generates most of the heat, but it's the chemical reactions that occur that actually cause the fire. You know, by the time the temperature in the pile has risen to 180, 190, 200 degrees, most of the bacteria have already been killed off by the heat. Most bacteria are killed somewhere between 130 and 165 degrees. So by the time that pile gets to 180, 190, 200 degrees, it's not the bacteria that's causing the pile to catch fire anymore. It's the chemical reactions that go on when the litter begins to get that hot. So what are the risk factors? What are the things we need to avoid? What are the things we need to be careful of when we're storing litter in a dry stack shed? By far, again folks, by far, the most critical factor in all litter storage fires is moisture. If you can keep the litter dry enough, it's not going to catch fire. Dry litter does not generate heat very well. However, wet litter does. So wet litter is the biggest cause, the moisture that's in that litter is the biggest cause of setting litter storage sheds on fire. Most common mistake is adding moist litter on top of dry litter that's already in that shed. Second most common mistake is allowing wind-driven rain to reach the stored litter. Again, if you've got a lot of rain that blows in on your stacking shed, you may have dry litter stacked in the shed, but if you've got a lot of wind-driven rain that blows in there and makes that litter wet, again, that litter can begin to generate heat from the anaerobic bacteria activity enough to the point where it can set the shed on fire. So a layering effect of wet and dry litter increases an insulated heat and moisture producing area where the two different types of litter meet is generally where things begin to go wrong. So if you've got dry litter in there and you put wet litter on top of it, where those two areas meet, that's what's going to be your troublemaker. What happens is that the dry litter begins to absorb moisture from that wet litter that you've just added. And again, anaerobic bacteria generate 50 to 65% methane and 30% CO2. If the moisture content in the pile is more than about 40%, and you've got very little oxygen because wet litter is heavy or you've got the litter packed down, anaerobic bacteria are going to thrive and produce a lot of methane. They're going to produce a lot of heat because they're very active. If the pile is not compacted and it has adequate pore space, that's not necessarily a problem because methane can be released to the atmosphere in that situation because again, the litter is not packed, there's a lot of pore space, it's easy for the methane and the heat that's being generated to get out of that pile, to get back into the atmosphere. So it will not concentrate in the pile and that lessens the fire danger. If it's compacted and the pore space is limited, however, the methane builds up in the pile, the heat builds up in the pile, and that does increase the fire danger. So let's talk a little bit about pile size, how much you've got in there, how long that pile is, how high that pile is, how wide that pile is inside your shed. Length is not that big of a deal. You know, as long as you can spread it out, the length is not the critical issue. It's the height and the width that are much more critical than the length of that pile or the length of your storage shed. The larger the pile, the greater the chance for excess heat and fire. Small piles provide a larger surface area for heat release, so it's easy for that heat and methane to be released from a smaller pile just because the surface area is greater. Litter should not be stacked more than about 7 feet high at the center of that pile. Anything over 7 feet is risky. Care should be taken when the litter is stacked against the shed walls, and try not to go any more than about 4 feet high over against the wall. You may have a 5-foot shed wall, but again, anything more than about 4 feet high is going to be a risk factor. Compaction, we talked a little bit about this. Do not pack or compact the litter with the tractor that's in the shed. When you're going back and forth, back your way out of that shed. Don't run over litter to get to a place to put more litter. Again, because compacting it encourages anaerobic conditions, and anaerobic conditions encourage increased methane and heat production. So everything goes wrong when you begin to pack that litter in there. You don't have enough pore space, it's too tight, the methane can't get out, the heat can't get out. And once it can't get out, it just begins to concentrate and build in that pile. So it lessens the available pore space for dissipation of both heat and methane whenever you're running back and forth over litter in the shed with your tractor. Layering. Again, we talked a little bit about layering. Care should be taken if you do layer litter, and a lot of people do. A lot of people add litter to what's already in their shed. But only dry litter should be added on top of litter that's already been stored in that shed for a while if you want to reduce the chance that you're going to have heat and methane buildup. Layering new moist litter on top of old dry litter, again, creates that little insulated area, and that's dangerous, and that's a heat producing situation and a methane producing situation as the moisture begins to seep from that wet litter into that dry litter and the bacteria become active. If you've got a lot of new moist litter that you're going to add to that shed, try to put it in a place where it's off by itself, at least for a few days. Try not to immediately pile it on top of what you've already got in the shed. So if you can, put it off by itself for a day or two and let some of that moisture dry out before you begin to place it on top of what's already in the shed. And a lot of times, cake litter is also wet litter. We always try to get the cake out of the way and put it in the shed or spread it immediately. But again, if you're going to put cake litter in your stacking shed, make sure that that litter is either reasonably dry, or if it is very wet, try to find a place to put it off by itself and let it dry out for a few days before you take it and put it on top of the litter that you've already got stored in your shed. Because again, wet litter has a high moisture content that can increase the fire danger as that wet litter and dry litter boundary begin to increase in the anaerobic bacteria when the dry litter starts to soak up moisture from all that wet litter. So use caution if cake litter is layered on top of dry litter. Be careful, watch it. But again, it's best to separate wet cake litter away from the dry litter in its own area of the shed until it has dried a little bit, and then you can take the front end loader and pile it on top of what you've already got in there. Smoking litter pile. If something does go wrong, and if you begin to notice that the pile is smoking, use caution and remove that litter from the structure as quickly and as carefully as you can. Make sure you've got some fire control equipment present, though, if that's the case, before you dig into a smoking pile, because it is hot enough that the litter may burst into flame as you dig into it with the front end loader and expose that stuff to air, because the oxygen in the pile is limited. And if you dig into it with your front end loader bucket and it's flat and it's hot enough and you get it exposed to the air again, you're feeding it fuel that it may need to go ahead and burst into flames. And if that happens, a garden hose is probably not going to be enough water to put that fire out. So if you can get in there and get it out, use care, spread it on the field, but make sure that you do not set the field on fire, because again, that stuff is very hot. So if you take smoking litter out of your shed and take it to the field, whenever you spread it, kind of monitor that field and make sure that that litter in there is not going to set your field on fire, because again, it is very hot. So best management practices. Again, dry litter is best to lessen any fire danger. If you're moving cake litter, if you're moving wet litter into your shed, try to put it by itself and make sure that you don't, encourage more bacterial growth by piling wet litter on top of dry litter. Protect stored litter from blowing rain. Try to keep it as dry as what you possibly can. Again, do not layer wet and dry on top of each other. Do not compact the litter. Again, that encourages anaerobic conditions because you've squeezed all the oxygen out of it. Do not stack litter over 7 feet high in the center or 4 feet high at the walls. Store wet cake litter in its own separate area of the shed until it dries out a little bit, if at all possible. And stack litter away from the walls to the extent possible to prevent heating the sideboards up to the wood's flash point. Again, if you get your walls hot enough, you can catch the wood on fire. Monitor the pile temperatures at various locations with a 36-inch compost thermometer. These things are fairly inexpensive, and they'll do a good job of helping you tell just exactly what's going on inside that pile. If you see temperatures that are 140 to 160 degrees, like what's on that thermometer in the picture, you don't have too much to worry about. That's not going to be hot enough to catch things on fire. But use caution if those temperatures begin to rise above about 160 degrees. And remove that stuff from the shed if you see temperatures that are up to 180 degrees or more. If it's 190 degrees or higher, there's where you have to be extremely careful. You may want to notify the fire department and use extreme caution when you begin to dig into that pile, because again, once that stuff gets oxygen fed to it, whenever you break into that pile with your front end loader, it may burst in the flames. Spread the material, but make sure the field does not catch fire. When you take stuff that hot to the field, go ahead and spread it, but then again, make sure that the grass in the field does not catch fire because of that hot litter. Do not store expensive farm equipment under a litter shed, because again, you can lose your tractors, combines, decaking machines, windrow machines, mowers, rakes, balers. Everything could be lost if you've got these things stored in your litter shed and the shed catches on fire. So to kind of summarize, litter storage sheds, again, are a vital part of every poultry operation's nutrient management plan these days and how they manage litter. Storage allows flexibility in timing land applications of litter to best meet the crop needs and to make sure you've got somewhere to go with it if it's raining in between flocks and you've got to get your cake litter out. It also lessens the possibility of polluting surface and groundwater because you've got it stored and in the dry. However, storage shed fires are possible because of heat and methane buildup in that stored litter, and spontaneous combustion can certainly occur under the right conditions. If there's enough heat, there's enough methane production, and everything's just right, you can catch your shed on fire. There are several factors that lead to spontaneous combustion in a litter storage pile. By far, the most critical factor on all of these is litter moisture, how wet that litter is, and how packed it is. But pile size, amount of cake litter, and how wet that cake litter is, the layering effect of wet litter on top of dry litter, and compaction are also important factors. Proper precautions, however, will greatly reduce shed fire risk. Good management practices and good common sense will keep your litter storage shed intact and working for you for many years to come if you manage everything right. With that, I'll say thank you for your attention.